Welcome and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Most of us as we approach midlife find that we actually want to get out and start on our own endeavor, especially when it comes to finding our own destiny. That usually involves trying to get into a mindset known as entrepreneurism. After all, a lot of people tend to spend most of their lives being an employee where you just kind of go to work, you do the best job you can, hope for the fact that you'll get raises, be able to put enough away for retirement, and forget all about it. But many of us find out that sometimes that track just doesn't work too well for us. On the program today, our guest has been launching and growing companies for the last 20 years, so he certainly understands the mindset of what it takes when it comes to wanting to be an entrepreneur. But he's taken it even a step much, much further than that, and what he's done is compiled a book simply titled How They Did It, Billion-Dollar Insights from the Heart of America, in which he interviewed and compiled a bunch of interviews together into a book that shows how other people commonly come together with mindsets and tell us what they say should be done to be successful in America. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Mr. Robert Jordan. Robert, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Daniel, thanks for having me on your show.
Now, what an interesting book, because a lot of times when people think that they want to get started with their own company or their own business, whatever the case is, they kind of fumble and falter, so they go out and find every book that they can that'll help find that sort of magic bullet that'll make them successful. Tell us about this book, How They Did It, and how you decided to embark on this journey of putting these stories together.
Well, I have to tell you that I personally didn't want to be the one coming up with the advice. What I did was to go to 45 company founders who had started from scratch and created really incredible success. And we had a very strict definition for that. A founder had to launch, grow, and sell a company for $100 million or more, or go public for $300 million or more. So I really wanted to get it straight from the horse's mouth. And what the book is, How They Did It, it is their quotes, their advice, their thoughts, straight from them. It is a book of quotes, and it's also question and answer from them.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you find as you were putting this together, first of all, tell us how long this particular project took you to put it together?
4 years.
4 years, okay. Now, did you find, interestingly enough, that there were a lot of consistencies with the people that you talked with?
Surprisingly, it's a great question, Daniel. Surprisingly, there are. All of these people started from scratch. They ended up as millionaires and billionaires. They started out like you and me, but from the point of launching their companies, things started to change. One of those things is that they actually, to your point in the introduction, they took a leap. I know this sounds kind of obvious, but one of the founders put it to me in an interesting way I'd never heard before. He said, most of us avoid failing, and avoiding failing is not a way to get to great success. And I thought about that for a bit, and I thought, he's right, because simply kind of taking baby steps in our careers and our actions, we stay safe, but that's not the way to hit a home run.
Mm-hmm. You're so right. There's a point where somebody says they've got a great idea, or they believe they've got a great idea, or there is a dream or a passion that they want to see come to fruition, but they spend a lot of time doing a lot of research. And as you said, it's basically kind of a way of saying, well, I'm avoiding failure. I'm trying to avoid making mistakes. I want that surefire way that ensures my success. But as you certainly see here, that's just not the way it usually works.
Right. One of the founders, Howard Tallman, who's launched over a dozen successful companies, I think he said it best. He said, if you wait for these perfect circumstances, it's never going to occur. And the only way you really do figure out the right solution is because you actually do go out there and start executing and making mistakes. And from those mistakes, that's where you tend to see the big success coming. What I found, Daniel, for most of these founders is that they struck out many more times than most people in business. It's just what they did with those mistakes they made was very different from other people. They didn't tend to view it as something where they were a bad person. They really just looked at it like it was an experiment to be improved upon.
I know we tend to really get involved in quotes and stories from people that we consider to be icons of past. For instance, when it comes to somebody that a lot of us know about who has gotten up and been a failure pretty much all the way through life was Abraham Lincoln. He's certainly been somebody who's been throwing a lot of curveballs. But it shows that perseverance is one of the keys to being successful as an entrepreneur. Tell us about that.
Yeah, you're right. It's funny because before you said his name, I had a picture in my head of Lincoln. Yeah, he lost at just about every political race he ran for prior to the presidency. Certainly the same is true here. I came to a conclusion from these founders, which is that first came the need, then came passion, and finally third on the list was skills, meaning that what really fired up these people was they spotted a problem or an opportunity in the world. And it generally was not rocket science. It was not that they saw something no one else would see. It generally, was they saw something everyone else saw and overlooked, some problem in the world, and they just got very curious, intensely curious, and that led to some passion. And that passion is what drove them to start a company or launch a product. And third on that list were skills. That in many cases they were good at forming teams around them, essentially acquiring those skills, but it wasn't nearly as important as the passion or as figuring out what the real need was.
Now, let's talk about some of the... It's interesting because as I was reading through the book, it was one that it's really kind of neat because you can pick it up, it sits on the table, you pick it up, you'll read through a little bit here, a little bit there, day after day, and you sometimes will just find that little magical miracles kind of come through where you sort of say to yourself, well, I really didn't think about it that way before. So you begin to feel more and more inspirational as you kind of go through this, kind of call it one of them inspirational type books. But, there's really a lot of great insights where, it's just like, for instance, just to share with the listeners, with my wife and I am producing this radio program. We've been producing it now for more than 7 years. One thing we've come to understand, and I've even read it here consistently, is that there aren't really any shortcuts. You just have to get in, roll your sleeves up, and just do what needs to be done. But the second thing, and the one that really comes out, is business is very non-linear. You don't just do A, B, and you get to C. Sometimes you skip around other letters of the alphabet before you even get to C. And these people found those same kind of challenges.
Totally right. Totally true. It's just not. It's not a straight path, and I think for most of these founders, the initial plan was not the one that became the home run. In most cases, what you'd call Plan B, the thing you did not foresee, that was the home run. And there were some remarkable examples from some of these founders where just along the way, based on the mistakes they were making, they finally figured out what the winning product or service was, and it was not the initial one.
Now, what I did notice, though, is that it seemed to be, with the people that you featured in the book, seemed to be involved in what you would call technology industries. Why is that?
Well, I had a particular focus because, what we call Heart of America, or the Heartland, we're dealing with the Rust Belt. And I thought that the hardest thing to prove out is technology. So the idea was, a lot of the world believes that technology can only really be done in Silicon Valley, and I wanted to see if we could disprove that. Could we find examples in the Rust Belt of amazing technology companies to really prove that people can do what they want where they want to do it?
Now, here's a quote that I'd like to take from the book that's pretty interesting, too, because a lot of us, first of all, there's a mindset about what a business owner is. And for most people, as they get started in a business by themselves, generally what they are is self-employed. In other words, they own a job, as Robert Kiyosaki of Rich Dad, Poor Dad would say. But the truth is, being a business owner is when you're able to walk away and the business continues to make money whether you're involved or not. And one of the quotes that I have in here is a big mistake entrepreneurs make, because what you eventually want to do is you want to be able to hire people so you can do this very thing I'm describing, is that they try to hire too many people like themselves. And that's the funny thing about starting a company, I think, with most people who are in it for their first run, is they're afraid that they won't be able to find somebody who does it just like them and there could be failure. Tell us what it takes for somebody to overcome that.
Daniel, you're reminding me of one of the quotes one of the founders said. we entrepreneurs should never do the hiring because we so much love to talk about what we're doing. We're so enthusiastic that you get this job candidate in the room, and if they're a good listener, then the entrepreneur spends all the time talking. And by the end of the interview, they just think this candidate is wonderful because they've been such a good listener. But they have no idea if that person has the skills to do whatever the job is required. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some truth to that. I think that the most successful company founders did a great job building management teams, and that specifically meant hiring people who were outstanding in their own competencies, which tended to be complementary to what the founders were, so that they weren't all duplicating the same kind of skill set.
Mm-hmm. Now, tell us, when you were doing this over 4 years and the fact that you've been in launching companies for the last 20 years, were there things that were actually, that came to the surface that surprised you from people that you were interviewing?
Well, it did. You know, here we selected an audience of 45 founders who they all had remarkable success, and you would think, well, you self-select a group like that, everything must have gone well. And it turned out to be the opposite. It turned out that every last one of them had challenges that hit them, and in some cases, unbelievable ones. I mean, for example, Rock Mackey, he's the co-founder of Tomotherapy, which is a public company. And at the point of launching the company, at the point of the start, they had a Fortune 50 partner. A big company was partnering with them, and that partner backed out. So they had to lay off the whole staff. Mm-hmm. Now, you think about that for most of, if you have friends that have ever started companies, and everybody starts with high hopes, but how is that when you have to fire everyone at the start? How do you ever come back from that?
Right.
And he went on to an IPO that was valued at about $1 billion.
Wow.
I thought that was pretty inspiring.
Absolutely. Totally true. Now, what advice would you give people based on what you learned here from your book when they're about to get started? I mean, the first thing is to get started, but what do you think were some of the common steps that a lot of these people took to basically get up every day and say, I know it seems like there's an impossible list in front of me, but it just needs to be done? What would you say to these people?
I'd say, for starters, don't plan to design the perfect product. I think a lot of us have this feeling, which is it's got to be right the first time. Mm-hmm. And the reality, especially around technology, is that's not the case. And one of the founders, Mahendra Vora, he said, you design it 60% of the way, and you let your customers do the last 40%. Now, that can sound a little bit bizarre, but it's actually the way that the world, I think, has played out over the past 30 years. Look at Microsoft. Windows 1.0 was awful, 2.0 awful, 3.0 awful. I mean, finally, 3.1, Windows 95, Windows 98, it finally got good, but it took, 25 years?
Right.
And I'm not saying that that's the perfect way to do it, but certainly the advice from all these founders is do not plan on perfection out of the gate. It's not possible. And all that will happen from that is you'll either freeze up or you end up spending all of your time and resources on one idea and one version, and that tends not to be the winner.
Ah. Now, here's the other illusion that I think a lot of people who have never started a business before have, and they believe that they need to have a lot of money or, something to get started with. Was that true in these cases?
No. Most of these, there were no overnight success stories. Mm-hmm. And in most cases, these founders started very modestly on their own resources. And that points to a host of problems that a lot of founders tend to have if they think, for example, that they have to go out and raise money initially. I mean, some ideas you do have to start out with money, and if that's the way it is, that's the way it is. But in most of the cases here, these were businesses that, even though they eventually hit billion-dollar valuations, they started very, very modestly. And it was only down the road that these founders ended up taking in what you could call institutional money, like venture capital or private equity or going public. It was not early on in most of these cases.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the quotes that really stood out for me, and I think it's because of what we have been through and doing what we've been doing with this program, is that I think sometimes people have the illusion that in the first year of business, if they're not starting to see that replace their income, maybe it's time to think about doing something else. But it actually takes time, as you said earlier in the program, patience. And it says here, and this comes from Joe Mansueto, is I think a lot of founders either give up too quickly or sell prematurely. You just have to hang in there and be patient. So I guess the question would be for our listeners is, how do we know how long that is before we either hang up the towel or sell the business, whatever the case may be?
You know, this is not a quote, Daniel, from someone in the book, but a friend of mine. When I was starting my first company, I dropped out of business school to start a company.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point I had a moment where I thought that I might be crazy because I had dropped out of school to do this. And I was talking to a friend, and I said, how do I know when I should stop talking to investors? And he said, how about when the last investor on the planet has said no? And I thought, okay, he's telling me to be persistent.
Right.
And I think it's just, that is the lesson that keeps on coming through from these successful founders, that your passion has to be the driving force when you're the entrepreneur. And there does come a point when a business, to the point you were saying earlier, when it becomes self-sustaining, and that's what you always want to see in the business. But in the early days, it is the drive of the founder or the founders, and I don't think there's a magic formula for that other than knowing it's going to be longer than you think.
Definitely longer than you think. I keep remembering a quote when we first got started that was actually from a John Wayne movie. And I said it was to my wife actually, she was like, after the first year, it's like, boy, you really got to sustain, we got to really maintain this, every day we got to keep going. And I said, well, I just kind of remember I was watching the movie, I believe it was Red River, and he was just simply saying, we're going to work for 10 years. We're going to work for 10 long years, and for some reason that stuck with me. Why 10 years? And I figured, why don't we just go that long, set that as a standard, and then see where we end up? It sure beats the heck out of, cutting it short in a year and going, geez, I thought we'd be a lot further along than we are now.
You're completely right, and after you and your wife have made this an incredible success, everyone is going to say, oh my gosh, it was just an overnight thing.
Yeah, it's always overnight, isn't it?
and that's the biggest reason I wanted to talk to these founders and do this book, because to the rest of the world, when it kind of pops into our consciousness that, oh, there's a Google out there, right, and they've gone public and it's worth billions of dollars, to the rest of the world, it feels like someone won the lottery. It feels like it's not fair.
Right.
And all that does is produce these feelings of jealousy and envy, and that's it. But if you actually know the story and you know how many years it took, here Google is 13, 14 years old now at this point. And you find out the incredible challenges that somebody had to overcome. Not only is it more understandable, but it can actually help you and your business to know, the mistakes maybe that you could avoid.
Mm-hmm. Now, of the stories that you put together in here, which one really had, I guess, a real impact on you?
That's a great question. I would have to talk about Raj Soin. He's in Ohio. He started a company called MTC with his wife for $1,700. It's IT services company. And I asked him what kind of challenges he hit, and he started laughing, and he said, well, payroll. And his wife was his bookkeeper, and one day she came in on payday, and she was crying, and there was no money, and he thought maybe the credit cards could cover it, and they couldn't. And I didn't really get an answer in terms of, well, how did you survive that? But then, 15 minutes later, we were talking about loyalty, and he said he was walking through the offices one day and walked into one of his manager's offices, and the guy's desk drawer was open, and he saw all these uncashed paychecks. And he asked the manager, named Mike, he said, Mike, why didn't you cash your paychecks? And Mike said, well, I saw that day when your wife was in your office crying. I knew it was payday. And I just decided not to cash my paychecks, and I knew sooner or later you'd be good for it. Now, Mike had never told Raj that he hadn't cashed his paychecks. And at that point, I thought, I kind of think this is the reason, this is the justification for me for doing this book, because there really are great things going on that the next generation of entrepreneurs would want to hear about. And Raj went on from that humble beginning. They ended up selling MTC to a company called BAE for $425 million. Wow. But it was all started on $1,700, and just think of that kind of loyalty, that you really can't put a price tag on that if you can have that kind of loyalty going back and forth between managers and employees.
Totally agreed with that. I think a lot of times, too, when you have people who decide to go and work for a company, and there was an experience, my dad actually started a company, and it was interesting how him and his business partner had to, because the company that they had worked for, apparently the owners had found out that they were looking to go into business for themselves. So lo and behold, they took both of them out to lunch and says, you've done a great job. We discovered that you guys want to kind of go out on your own, so we figure we're going to kind of help you. So today is a 2-week notice lunch. Sometimes you just have to burn that ship to get things done.
That did it.
And there was certainly some of that going on in here in your book, wasn't there?
I think some of that. Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of different examples in there.
Mm-hmm. Now, you have a website people can find out more about your book, how they did it, and what can people expect to find on there?
There's a website at www.howtheydiditbook.com. There is a Facebook page at How They Did It, and there are thousands of fans there. And the conversation's going on continuously, Daniel. We keep on interviewing more entrepreneurs and joining the conversation. Mm-hmm. And so we welcome learning more about more stories, and we're starting work on a second book that's more of a global version of this.
Well, it's very exciting because I think if people can find out what the particular freedom that going into developing and launching a business can have, the personal growth that you experience, for instance, that there is a lot more valuable than the money you make, even though capital is very important to keep a business not only running but growing. But it's you yourself that you discover through this book, How They Did It, that's most important. How much are you willing to grow and learn and continue to learn, to be perseverant, for instance. And I think that's what really stands out about this, and the fact that it does not happen overnight, so you got to be willing to get up, brush off, and be willing to learn.
You're completely right, and look, I'll tell you, I'm the first reader of this book, and I took it to heart. I mean, these are not people who are easy to bring out, and so just the entire process of doing the book, I took my own inspiration from what these founders had to say just to get the book done.
Very good. Robert Jordan, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. It's always great to have talks like this, especially for our particular listening audience who want to figure out, I think I can do this, but I need some inspiration. Move me into that direction, the courage to get started.
Daniel, thanks so much for having me on your show.
You bet. Again, the book is How They Did It. Our guest today, Mr. Robert Jordan. We also want to thank you for joining us here on the program. Be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. Sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. Remember, live your day past halfway.